overall, to give you a sense of the ground we're going to cover, we're going to look very shortly at why dialogue matters and what dialogue is. This might be very familiar to some of you. And then we're going to look at the notion of container building and how having that safe, energizing space is so central to having a good conversation. And then a bit later in the session, I'll be sharing some approaches about how you can go about creating a container for dialogue and indeed sowing seeds for creating a culture of dialogue in an organisation. And maybe just that's my last point before I hand across to Claus. I'm sure many of you will know that in the coaching literature, much has been written in recent times about creating a culture of coaching in an organisation. And I've really taken inspiration from that in thinking about how do you create a culture of dialogue. And central to that, as I say, would be having these spaces where dialogue can happen. So on that note, Claus, I'm going to hand across to you.
Yes, thanks. So as Sarah mentioned, since you're here, you probably agree that dialogue is very important, and you're probably familiar with some of the challenges that can arise when dialogue is absent. But just to sort of refresh our memories. So many times when you see teams performing poorly, it can be a result of unresolved dynamics, and this is one of the things that can flourish in the absence of dialogue. Sometimes you see in organizations, you see these kind of turf wars between different managers, different leaders who are competing with each other. Maybe different department managers. Often when in the beginning everything is fine, but then I think even if you go beyond something as small as 20 employees, the moment you put up the first wall and you have to sit in different rooms, you know how all the problems are the fault of the people on the other side of the wall. And this only gets worse, of course, when organizations grow. And here again, dialogue is crucial to counteract that tendency. So yes, infights, sometimes also unsuccessful hires is one of the symptoms of lack of dialogue. Maybe there was a lack of dialogue before the hire occurred. So not everybody was on the same page with respect to what are we looking for? What does this new person need to be able to do? What are the functions? And sometimes the lack of dialogue is after the hire. So you run into problems that could have been avoided if there had been more ongoing dialogue with the new hire and sort of finding this person's place in the organization. So, and sometimes organizations are also very focused on KPIs, measuring things. And measuring things is absolutely amazing and definitely something to be done. But sometimes if we don't have the dialogue, we get too obsessed with the numbers. And also we might individually have different ideas about what they mean. So this can be very problematic, and then we can get into this familiar space where rather than doing a good job, we do whatever we need to do to make the KPIs look good. And so this is, of course, also detrimental to organizational performance. So these are just some. There are many other things that are problematic in the absence of dialogue. And this is why it's so important to not just have dialogue as something that we engage in every now and then, and in particular when everything has gone wrong, but really creating a culture where dialogue is the norm, where there's set of times for it. It's the go-to tool that people use even before things have gone off the rails. And so having that culture where that's just the norm. Yes, I remember. And this is not always easy to do, because dialogue is, of course, not just talking to each other, right? Dialogue is something very particular. In the dialogue work, we distinguish between different types of conversations. So, for example, you can have monologues. Sometimes conversations is a little more than serial monologues. I do my monologue, and then you do your monologue while I'm waiting to do my next monologue. Anybody know this? Yes. And of course, monologues can be fine. There's totally a room for monologues. In certain situations, monologues are great to deliver information and so on. But the kind of situations that I mentioned before, monologues will not deal with them. And then, of course, you have other forms of conversation like debate and discussion. Debates are often characterized with, I have a standpoint, somebody else has a different standpoint, and then we fight it out, right? And we see who wins. And again, taking a stand and really giving it your all to articulate that particular perspective, and then somebody else doing the same, can be fantastic. Sometimes you can reveal a lot of good stuff doing that. But again, if the situation is a turf war, you probably have a lot of debates already, and they didn't do anything, right? And many times you will have the same debate over and over and over again. And you will say, well, how many times do we need to have this debate before the other person realizes I'm right, right? So sometimes we have these situations where neither participant's perspective does it. Neither participant's perspective can solve the situation, and therefore we need to engage in a different kind of conversation that's more about thinking together, where we hold our points of, we can take a point, but we hold it lightly. So we're willing and able to move between points. And if we take a point, it's not a compulsion, it's a conscious decision. We do it because it contributes to the dialogue. So this is how we look at dialogues, right? Isaacs has this wonderful definition of a dialogue, saying that it's a conversation with a center but not sides. So we have this question in the center, or we have this topic in the center, and we look at it from different perspectives, but we are not battling around it. We are just the dialogue. The purpose of the dialogue is to develop shared understanding of the question or the topic that we are looking at. So if dialogue should be an integral part of the culture, how do we do that? Of course, you can hire me and Sarah, and we'd be happy to come and help you with having dialogues. But at some point, we leave and go to the next place. And then how do you solidify it, or how do you make dialogue practice just a part of the culture, a natural part of the culture? And so Sarah and I, we were putting our heads together before this webinar and thinking like, what would be some simple, practical tools that you can implement from today, which can help you bring your organization, help you develop that culture in your organization. And so let me just find some slides here. See, just want to share my screen. There we go. Good. So developing a culture of dialogue is very much about creating a container, because dialogue being in a dialogue doesn't mean that everything is always nice. Often dialogue is something that we use, especially when things are not nice, when things are a little testy or a little bit, people have strong opinions and strong emotions. And this is why it's so important to build a container that can contain this my Wi-Fi just dropped out. Oh, okay, yes, hope it stabilizes again. Excellent. Good, so it's important to build a container that that can hold this kind of strong energy. And one very simple tool for doing it is to use check-ins. And we did that when we started this meeting. We just said, where's everybody coming from, and what brought you here, and what do you hope to get out of it? So check-ins is just that. You go around the room, everybody says something. It doesn't have to be much, but just a little something, and you can have some questions to focus the check-in. That's often very nice. You can think about some questions that help people say a little, sort of open up the topic that you want to have a dialogue around. And the benefit of using check-ins is, first of all, it brings all the voices into the room. Many times in organizations, when you have meetings, there might be a few very dominating voices who are quick to grab the microphone and say their piece, and then you might have other people who maybe are a little less more shy, or maybe they are more junior people, maybe they think that they are not supposed to speak in the meeting, and so on. There can be many different reasons why people don't say something, but it's a pity, because many times the people who don't say something, they might have a perspective, they might see something that is crucial to bring to the dialogue. Another thing is, when you start off by doing a check-in, then everybody will hear their voice in the room, and it just sets that pattern for full participation. It shows very clearly that what is expected is that everybody can participate. So it engages people more. Sometimes if you don't say something in a meeting, then the more time passes, the harder it becomes to pop in, right? If you haven't said anything for 10 minutes and suddenly you say something, you might expect people to go, oh, you're here, what happened? It can be a little bit funny. And you overcome that or break that by simply having a check-in where everybody speaks in the beginning. It also encourages people to land. Sometimes people, we have a lot of meetings, especially nowadays when a lot of meetings are online. We no longer have that transition period between meetings, right? Sometimes they're booked back to back, and your head might be full of thoughts from another meeting, and you click the participation button and boom, you're there in another meeting. And so the check-in helps you orient yourself, remember, oh yeah, what was this meeting about? Oh yes, now I land in this meeting, and this is also really important. It also creates the psychological sense of safety. There's something about when you've heard from everybody and a little snippet from everybody, you get a sense where everybody stands, you say a little bit about yourself, and it creates that connection to everybody in the room, and connectedness is really something that brings psychological sense of safety. As soon as we hear a little something from everybody, and it can be something personal also, just how are you today? One of the questions that Sarah and I are often using is, what is the energy that you're stepping in with today? And if people just say, well, I'm a little ruffled because, that happened, it brings a lot of psychological safety. And so it's a very good way of just overall changing the discourse, making it more into a discourse of dialogue. So this is one very effective tool. Sarah and I uses it all the time, check-ins. You can also, I said that one of the ways of focusing a check-in is through questions. Another way of focusing a check-in that we often use is by using sentence stems. So if you want a dialogue around, for example, purpose, which Sarah has worked a lot with, you might, one of the sentences that Sarah often uses is, what is something that makes you proud about working here? And completing that sentence will bring a lot of information that is really good, creates a good starting point for a conversation around purpose. So being creative with sentence stems is also a good way of focusing a check-in. So that was one tool. The other tool is group agreements. And this is something that we can do at the beginning of a meeting. It doesn't have to take long. And if you develop a set of agreements, which is like, these are the agreements that, these are the things that we agree to. When we talk together, we abide by these rules. And if you develop that in an organization, you can just, if you have a slide, you can just put them up and just to sort of bring them into the room, reminding people of these agreements. And people will say, oh, yeah. And the more you hear the agreements, you don't need to, you can use 30 seconds really on the agreements. But again, it's just a good way of setting the tone for the dialogue. And so group agreements that Sarah and I often use for our workshops is keeping confidentiality. And this is, of course, like these agreements, you'll have to find the ones that work for you. Maybe keeping confidentiality is very useful for you. Maybe you are in a situation where it's not so useful. For us, it's extremely useful because we are running workshops, and it's important that when we run workshops, people should feel free to share personal experiences without concern that those stories that they share will leave the room. Because sometimes in order to work with dialogue and learn about dialogue, we have to look at situations and air our thoughts about the situations, and we really don't want, we want control over who hears those stories, let's put it that way. So this is extremely important. Another one is be present and listen fully. Sometimes it just translates into, if you have a dialogue that about something that's important, it's best not also to be on your mail or your phone or sort of having your attention somewhere else. Sometimes in the check-ins, we will ask people to say whatever they need to say to enable them to be present and listen fully. Sometimes something is bothering you and you just go like, oh, like we just had this technical glitch, right? This is on our mind, and just saying it will then say, okay, fine, I said it, now I can be present, right? I got that out of my system. Another one, which I think is an agreement that you can just copy and paste, because this I think is an agreement that is crucial if you want to create a culture of dialogue, and that is to welcome uncomfortable moments. If we are too concerned with politeness and too concerned with avoiding discomfort, chances are that we are going to end up avoiding talking about the things that are really important. Because many times when things are really important, again, that's where people have strong opinions and strong emotions. And sometimes when there are strong conflicting opinions attached to strong emotions, not everybody will experience that as comfortable per se. And so it's important to have that agreement where you say, well, let's expect that it might not happen. But if uncomfortable moments arise, it's better to take care of them rather than to scramble to sort of get out of them and get back to something comfortable. Be on time. That's of course also just, if you want a good culture of dialogue, it's very nice that everybody's there from the start of the meeting. Otherwise there will be too much. Dialogue is really a transformative process. And so you start the dialogue, and then the dialogue takes you for a ride. And you want to be there from the start to participate in that transformation. Free to pass, this is something that we do. Again, this is one that's very important for us because we do a lot of exercises, and sometimes, again, to create the psychological safety, it's important that people have the possibility of passing. And I think in meetings, again, not to force people to be put on the spot. Sometimes people haven't really gathered their ideas, or they're still waiting for something to emerge. And it's fine to give it that time to emerge rather than to say, no, you have to speak now. Many times when we do the check-in, personally, I really like to do it popcorn style, where people just drop in when they are ready. Sometimes you can also do the circle, but in the circle sometimes it's like as your turn is approaching, you're sort of like spending all your energy not listening but just figuring out what you should say, and as after you said it, then you're not listening because you're evaluating whether what you said was nice or not, right? So so I like this popcorn style, where people are more free to step in, step out, as when in their own flow. Nobody gets it wrong. Again, something that we say a lot, and something that can sometimes be, it takes a little while before it seeps in and becomes part of the culture, and a true part of the culture. But this is important for dialogue. Sometimes in a fruitful dialogue, you might see something and you blurt it out, and then somebody else says, but have you thought about this? And then you go like, oh yeah, that was completely stupid what I just said, right? Or this, but it was still important to blurb it out because it prompted that other person to say something. And in this way, nothing is wrong. When you see it, it's good to contribute with that to the dialogue. And even if you say something that is that you later say, oh, that was completely silly, it is still a contribution. And in that way, there really is nothing that's wrong in that sense. I used to work a lot with songwriters. And songwriters, they often have this tradition of writing songs together, co-writing songs. And one of the things that songwriters in this culture where it's very common to co-write songs, there's a lot of singer-songwriters that meet and they just co-write songs with each other constantly. And in that culture, it's very common to say, once a song has been created, everybody in the room gets an equal share of the royalties for that song. Even if you have been sitting there and none of your words made it into the lyrics, none of your chords made it into the song, you haven't played anything on the song, none of your licks made it into the song, you still get an equal share of the royalties for the song. Why? Because your contributions was part of the process and prompted other people to contribute something. And so there is that understanding that it's kind of silly to evaluate every single bit or contribution to the dialogue. Oh, was this a good one? Was this a bad one? Was this a good one? Was this a bad one? Because it is really just everybody sharing what they see in that moment from their particular perspective. And that's what makes the dialogue possible. And of course, with group agreements, it's always good to have this open-ended anything else. Is there something that we're missing? Because who knows? Group agreements can develop over time. Maybe as you get more experience with dialogues in your organizations, you discover other agreements that really helps promote the culture and helps make your dialogues very productive. So that was another tool. We had the check-ins and we had the group agreements. And I'll hand it back to Sarah.
So thank you. Yeah, I'm going to come on to this third tool, this third approach very shortly. Maybe just make a couple of points about container building more generally, building on what Claus has said there. So one thing is something I once heard Bill Isaacs say. So William Isaacs, he's the author of the seminal text in dialogue, or one of the seminal texts, which is the book Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. And I had the good fortune of working with Bill for about 5 years. And in one of our sessions, there were probably about 25 people in the room. He just came out with this phrase that said, as the container is, so goes the conversation. As the container is, so goes the conversation. And I just thought that was a brilliant summary of what we're trying to convey here. And that there are very tangible aspects to building a container. For example, having a room that's spacious enough that ideally would have some natural light, where you could sit chairs in a circle, you could use the space flexibly. And then there are these more intangible dimensions, and that's what Claus has been speaking to in some ways. You're getting the right group agreements in the room, holding a check-in, setting the tone so that the atmosphere feels welcoming and inclusive of all the people who are there, whatever the level of contribution. And a quick example from a team that I worked with recently. So this is a large organisation in the not-for-profit sector. And it was a meeting, a couple of days meeting, and we had the board members there and we had the trustees there. And some of the trustees were service users, and some of them had what they would call advocates with them to support them. So this was another layer to the dialogue. And we had a group agreement there, which was no question is a stupid question, just to provide that welcome and that warmth. So I think Claus has given us a great set of possible group agreements. And of course, you might well have ones that would work in your particular organisational setting. Just one other point I want to make about a container is that it goes beyond psychological safety. And it's great to see Amy Edmondson's notion of psychological safety getting so much attention at the moment, and it's absolutely essential. And in dialogue work, I think we also need, in addition to that sense of safety, a sense of energy and a sense of possibility, that people are in the room not just thinking, oh, this could be another talking shop, or, oh, all talk, no action. But you convey a sense, to borrow the word that Claus used, that this could actually be transformative. This could actually change something. We might actually finally make a decision or come up with our new strategy or whatever it is. So we're looking to have not just safety, but energy and possibility in the room as well. And in terms of this final tool we're going to share with you then, I'm just going to acknowledge where some of the thinking comes from for some of the parts of this tool. And this is having done myself quite a deep dive into the world of systemic constellations. If that means nothing to you, don't worry. But that way of working is a way of mapping systems in a very embodied way. People are up on their feet, and you create maps of systems. So I did a lot of that work for about 5 years, and what I came to see was that dialogue sometimes really drops onto a deeper level when people aren't sitting in a circle of chairs, when you disrupt the dynamics in some way, when people are moving around the room, or you've got different patterns of interaction going on. So you're going to see a flavour of that in this final tool. So on that note, Claus, could we please come to the next slide? And there's just a few examples on here of doing that different way of working. So I think we've got to go, there we go. I've called it disrupting stuck dynamics, creating quite intentionally a perturbation or a disruption in the room. So the first one here is, you could call it a continuum line. So many of you will be familiar in your coaching work with, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you stand? And you can do this with a group. A classic one for me, if I'm working with an intact team, is that I might share a definition of a high-performing team, and I'd say, okay, there's no right or wrong place to be on this line, but at this end of the room, it would be 10 out of 10 in terms of being a high-performing team. And then you've got the other end of the room, the complete opposite of that. And I just invite people to stand in the place that represented their perception of the current reality. And you can have a great dialogue with people spread across the room. People might change their position as they hear other people speak. So that's an example of a continuum line. A clock face, and this is straight out of systemic work, where you really pay attention to the aspect of time, how long somebody has been in a system. And so again, this might be working with an intact team or with at least people from the same organisation. And at 12 o'clock on the clock face stands the person with the longest length of service, the person who's been in the system for maybe 20 years or however long, and it comes round, if you like, in chronological order, right round to 11 o'clock, where you have the most recent joiner. And again, this can be very helpful for getting you into dialogue. It's a way of acknowledging the people who are the seasoned members of the organisation, who might not also be the most senior people in the room. So I've created clock faces where the CEO, for example, has been stood at 8 o'clock on that clock face. They're not stood at 12 o'clock. And it really helps to acknowledge the organisational memory that the people earlier in the clock face hold. It's a way of respecting them and their experience. So that's a clock face. There's much more I could say about it, but hopefully as I'm speaking you can be imagining how these different patterns work. Maybe you've used them already in your own work. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with using a fishbowl. I've also called it here a learning circle. So you might change the setup of the room and have an inner circle of chairs and an outer circle of chairs. And the only people who get to speak are the ones in the inner circle. And you can set up very fluid dynamics so people can leave the inner circle, take a seat on the outer circle, or you could have the people in the outer circle tapping somebody on the shoulder to create a free seat. You can play with this. But what this pattern does is it stops people in a way from doing so much reloading. It forces people to listen, particularly when they're in the outer circle, because they're not able to speak, and it can slow the dialogue down. So that's the notion of the learning circle. Number 4, a bit of a curious one, run the war. This is one I learnt from Bill Isaacs. This was his phrase, where you might have 2 camps in the room, or you might have 3 subgroups in the room. And it might be a little bit counterintuitive, but you separate people out into those subgroups to amplify the difference, to then build bridges later. And again, with this choreography, there's all sorts of things that you can do. I'm going to be very brief. You might, for example, say to each of the subgroups, you might invite them to reflect on their own group and come up with their greatest strengths. And also, what are their areas for development? And they will often be more critical of themselves than the other groups might be. You can then open it up for feedback, between the different groups. You can open it up for appreciations from one group to the other groups and so on. But that splitting out into the different camps can really help to build bridges, although it's not perhaps an obvious thing to do. And very quickly, just go round sometimes. In dialogue, we're often working quite fluidly. We're in a generative space if we're in dialogue, and sometimes it's helpful actually to go for something more structured, again, just to change the dynamic and the tempo. So sometimes you might see at a session with Claus and I, we come back after lunch and we actually go round the circle and just do a temperature check, a pulse take, hear something from each person. Again, they would be free to pass, just to get a full sweep of the room at that point. And it can be a good pace changer to do that. A variation on that could be pass the baton. We hear from everybody, but we're not going round the circle. A person speaks and then they nominate the next person and so on until you've heard from everybody. And the beauty of that is that you've got to concentrate and remember who has spoken and who hasn't spoken, so that you pass the baton to somebody who's not yet spoken. So it actually keeps people, it helps people to stay present. And then finally, raising the dead dog, or with one team I worked with, they actually had a notion of the smelly fish. So this is, in a way, it's a variation on the elephant in the room. Everybody knows there's a smelly fish in the room, but nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody really wants to acknowledge it. Even so, what I've done with some teams is, and I would not be doing this on the first morning, perhaps not even on the first day, this is like a day 2 activity, is to invite people to write on a piece of paper a smelly fish that there is in that team or in that group, just one item. It can be anonymous, they don't need to put their name to it. I then collect them in and they all go in a hat or an envelope, and then somebody pulls one out at random. And the agreement is that whatever is on that piece of paper, whatever that dead dog is, then we have a conversation about it. And sometimes just introducing an element that is both inclusive, because everybody gets to have make a contribution, but also random. It's only one topic maybe that gets pulled out of the envelope, again, can sometimes just change the energy in the room that can get you into that dialogue. As Claus was saying earlier, it might not be that comfortable, but actually the little bit of time that is uncomfortable can be well worth it in terms of things getting aired and shared. So that is our third tool there, disrupting stuck dynamics. And on that note, Claus, I'm going to suggest we end the slide deck there. We have actually got more material, but I think just in the last 10 minutes or so that we have together, I'd just like to open it up really for questions, comments. Love to hear any of your experience, for example, with a favourite check-in question that you might use. But let's just open up the space and just hear any questions or comments. It's a good question. And I have sometimes worked in quite a physical, embodied way with people online. Sometimes I've used floor markers, so got people to, for example, in the world of purpose exploration, I've sometimes got people to have one piece of paper for their organisation's purpose, one for their personal purpose. and invited them to put them on the floor, and notice how close together they are, how aligned they are. I might invite them to stand on that piece of paper. So, and that's straight out of systemic constellations work. If I know I'm going to work in that way, I often let people know in advance and sort of say, it'd be helpful if you've got space to move about. You could always switch your camera off if you wanted to. And the other thing, and Claus, I'm going to hand across to you for any other thoughts in a moment, that I also sometimes use, Emma, is just, the good old chat box. So with the continuum line, for example, you obviously can't get people lined up, but I might still use some kind of scaling and then invite people to put their number in the chat, and then invite people, well, let's hear from the person who's put a 3 and then a 7. And I've sometimes done scaling in that way online. Claus.
I think we recently we also discussed how to do the fishbowl online, and I think, wasn't it what we came up with was something like something you can hold up so that you can see whether you're in the inner circle or the outer circle, right? Something physical you can show on screen. I think that's what we settled on.
Yeah, I think, Claus, we also had cameras off and cameras on.
Oh, that's true. That was another one, that we thought about. Yes. Yeah. So then you can sort of come on and now you're part of the conversation, or off and then you're listening. Yeah.
Yeah, and that has worked well for the fishbowl. Yeah. Is that enough of an idea? I really appreciate the question. Yeah, it's a good question. With that process, I've not encountered that exact scenario, or a scenario where I've not felt able to dive into that one. But I think it's good to anticipate that it could happen. I think as the facilitator, as the group coach, whatever the role is you're in holding space, I think you should feel free to use your judgment. And if that is not going to be a helpful conversation, not to go there. And what you're also making me think, and Claus, I don't know if you can add to this, is whether you might give a little bit more guidance about the hairy goat or the smelly fish before you get to the writing stage, so that you're clear about what the intention of the exercise is. So this isn't about getting really personal about one individual in the room. It's not about airing a grievance towards that individual, but it is, the intention here is to make an undiscussable in the team or in the group more discussable. And so we're keeping our eye on the collective rather than making it about one individual. If that makes so, a bit of extra guidance could be helpful at the outset. Yeah. Claus, do you want to add anything to?
Yeah, I think I was just imagining if I again, I have also not experienced that exact scenario, but I think if I drew a paper like that, right? I mean, it sounds very honest, right? Somebody saying like, well, this person is a bully or something like that, and it's definitely there's a conversation to be had there. I think I would probably take charge of the beginning of the conversation and ask exploratory questions, like by raise of hands, how many people feel that there is bullying in the team, maybe not by this particular person, but some sort of bullying. Ask clarifying questions about what exactly counts as bullying. And so in that way, by me being curious and just go like, I read this paper and I have a lot of questions now, right? And by being curious and asking these non-personal questions, you can kind of open up the conversation without sort of saying, okay, let's have a talk about Bob or what the name was, right? Because I don't think many times what Sarah and I are working with in dialogue is also dialogue often happens around a question, and I think a very useful way of thinking about it, which we recently ran a 10 session course for Chinese managers, and we said these are the sort of 4 different kind of practices that you need, and then we looked at the practices as individual practices and as group practices, and that was a really useful way of splitting up. So there's how do you voice your personal opinions, how do you encourage a group to bring voice to something. So, and one of the things that we talked about there was when you're working with a group, having a dialogue, you put a question in the center, and you can think about those questions you put in the center in the same way as a coach would think about putting questions to an individual person. So when you ask, when you work as a coach with an individual person, there are certain questions that are going to be really fruitful. And in the same way, you can think, if I ask questions to a group, what are the kind of questions that can be really fruitful? And is Bob a bully? Is probably not one of them. But what is bullying and what counts as bullying to you? That might be something that's really interesting to sort of put as a question in the center of the group. So I think I would look and say, okay, what kind of questions can I put at the center in order to address the issue that this piece of paper intends to address? Yeah, I don't know if is that helpful.
Mhm.
Yes, I think one of the things that we often do is you can simply just say, like if the leader says something, you can say, okay, now poke holes in that, right? The purpose of anything that anybody says now is to contradict it and find flaws with it. That's what we're doing now. Sometimes that can be because then you take it on you as a facilitator to say, I'm deciding that we have to find flaws with that perspective. And if you want to sort of say something smart, you have to not agree. And sometimes I will say it's a wonderful point they're making, but just for the fun of it, let's trash it, right? Maybe I won't say trash it, but but that will be the intention. I think that's that's one way that I really like to invite that what in dialogue we would call opposing, especially when it's opposing somebody in a role of power or authority. I don't know, Sarah, that was just the first that pops up.
I'll just give a very quick response, James, mindful of we're nearly out of time. This is only really in the context of if you're coaching that leader, or you can whisper a word of counsel in their ear, which would be to cultivate the discipline of listening first. And then you get to have your say. But once you've heard from everybody else in the room or the other people who want to contribute, because as you're rightly pointing out, James, the leader's voice often carries a disproportionate amount of weight. And that can be such good growth for a leader. But of course, they have to be up for that. Yeah. If the technology has worked this week, we'll get the recording of this session out to you. We're still working on a glitch that I had last week's session, and we're happy to share the slides as well. We've got 3 more webinars coming up, different topics, different angles on dialogue at the same slot. On a Monday, you'd be very welcome to come to those if this has whetted your appetite at all. And Claus, do you want to mention just finally what we're doing in March?
In March, there's an open 2-day course on dialogue. So if you want to get a lot more tools and tricks and practice some of this, then you're very welcome to join that. And we'll send a link to the description when we send out the recording.
So maybe we could all just unmute ourselves and say goodbye and farewell. And I hope this has been useful for you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Claus.